Greetings, Catholic unscripted viewers. Very pleased to welcome you here today. I've been meaning to do this for a while. I'm gonna do a deep dive, one of my old deep dive videos. Perhaps it's worthwhile explaining from the outset what the point of doing this sort of thing is, and that is so that we can go through an article together, and I can talk to you about the information contained within that article, and we can help each other to understand it, and we can build a kind of community because we all know where we're coming from, we know what's going on, and we know how, please God, how to best sort of cope with it. Why talk about the things that are going on in the church? Well, I think the most important thing that I can say about it is that we've made a difference. We have made a difference. It's well documented to Pope Francis. If there's a pushback against some of the crazy things that he's trying to implement, then it really makes a difference. So one of the results of Pope Francis' papacy is that the laity are better informed about issues in the church and better informed about teaching, because it's forced us to look at the teaching, hasn't it? To say, well, what is going on with this issue and why is this a problem? And so that, I think that's one of the fruits that God is bringing out of this pontificate. I was recently, earlier this week, interviewed on Joe McLean's A Catholic Take. So I've been on there a couple of times, and you can find my video down here. Can you see it? This is it. I hope the sound is off. Yes, right. So this is me talking to Joe. And we had a great discussion there, and it was about this article. It was about this article that I'm going to talk to you about today, which is an article that was in Unheard online. Just pull it up for you, and it's by Damien Thompson. Now, Damien is a very well-respected, highly respected journalist in the UK, and you may well have seen him on Raymond Arroyo, The World Over Live, if you watch that on EWTN. But he was the religion correspondent for The Telegraph. He's got a doctorate as well. He's a very well-educated man, a well-known Catholic in the UK, and he has been commentating on religious news for many, many years, and he knows an awful lot about it. He was the editor of the Catholic Herald and left a couple of years ago now, and he now writes largely for The Spectator, which is like a conservative publication in the UK, but he also sometimes writes for Unheard. And this article is on Unheard, and I mean, it's interesting. Just that's interesting. Why is it on Unheard and not on The Spectator? It's his big problem, his big bugbear, which he's absolutely correct to have, is why aren't the mainstream media interested in picking up on some of the scandals that surround Pope Francis' papacy? If you remember, at the end of Pope Benedict's papacy, there was it Vatican leaks, and there was the butler leaked some diaries and different information, some documents, and that was all over the press. They couldn't get enough of any scandal that involved Pope Benedict XVI. And there's loads of awful stuff that's gone on with Pope Francis, and no one seems interested in reporting it. And so that's why Damien is, asking that question, which is a really important question, because we can learn something about Pope Francis's gender, how it's being received, and what role the media play in disseminating that information as well. I think it's probably more pertinent to look at the fact that certain Catholic publications, are just completely ignoring these issues, and they are the publications that tend to push a more progressive side of Catholic understanding. So they are the organisations like the National Catholic Reporter in America, the Tablet here in the UK, America Magazine in America, the Jesuit Magazine, and they are constantly questioning Catholic doctrine and have done for years and years and years, rather than faithfully sort of trying to explain it to people. And ever since I've sort of became committed to my faith, I really have struggled with those organisations. I've struggled with the fact that that's what they're doing, and that intelligent people really in the UK, intelligent Catholics that I know, faithfully read the tablet, and that they think that that is an orthodox position then, that you can hold a sort of cafeteria Catholic position, that you can pick and choose what you want to believe from the faith. And that massively, what you tend to find is that these people then, their children don't practice the faith, and they're puzzled about why they've fallen away. And it's often really some of the people that I'm thinking of in my own life are, good Catholics, who really do believe it, but they have got this sort of more progressive approach. And because publications like the Tablet aren't calling out the controversies that surround Pope Francis, they either think they're not happening, or they think that they're just made up or whatever. And like I say, it's not just about scandal mongering. I think it is important that we look at these issues, because it does matter. And if we push back against it, if we understand the arguments, then we can make a difference. And that has a difference that changes the world, because, as goes the Catholic Church, so goes the world. As goes the family, so goes the world. So this was just on April the 27th, this document, this publication in Unheard. I'll put the link in the show notes so you can have a look at it. And Damien sort of tops it up by talking about everyone's really interested in the conclave now and what the Cardinal's going to vote like. We'll get to that. It's towards the end of the document. Damien says the Cardinals are already meeting to discuss who should be the next Pope. Some of the liberal ones who feel safe because they're in favour with the ailing Pope Francis can be seen comparing notes in a bar near the gates of the Vatican. The conservative Cardinals are more nervous. They gather at suppers in each other's apartments, or if they can trust the fawning waiters not to betray them, in a favourite restaurant. Perhaps you can see the flash of a bishop's ring as he taps a piece of gossip into WhatsApp. The Holy See employs world-class electronic spies, so everyone uses a private phone rather than the Vatican-issued ones. Even the phone tappers are busy exchanging information because, like everybody in Rome, they suspect that the painfully fragile Francis, who is often too short of breath to read out his own sermons, hasn't long to go. Now, that's interesting because last weekend Pope Francis was in Venice. He visited Venice, and he read all of his speeches, and he met loads of people. He had really ambitious agenda. So we have seen this coming out, that Pope Francis is not very well, and that he can't read, and he hasn't said mass for ages. That's just a matter of fact. But I mean, I'm as likely to believe that that's because he doesn't really care much about the liturgy as anything else. But we've got this narrative coming out that because he's not reading out, is because he hasn't read out some of his speeches, that he's sort of on his last legs. And that may well be the case. He is 87, but equally we could have another 10 years of him, so let's not get carried away. And like I say, in Venice last weekend, he seemed absolutely fine. Ludwig Ring-Eiffel of the German news agency K&A said in January that seeing the Pope so short of breath. So this speaks to this point, this paragraph here. So I remember this report coming out where this guy said that it was difficult and that it was, like he was sort of living on borrowed time. I remember this one particularly, Andrew Napolitano, who said that he was staying in the guest house behind St. Peter's, and the Pope's in poor health, can hardly speak or walk. He radiates sadness. Well, go and look at the footage for last Sunday. Let's see if we can pull up some footage from last Sunday. Pope Francis in Venice. Videos. Okay, let's get it up. You tell me. Now, I did say on Joe McLean's show that so here he is talking. You probably can't hear that.
And this is why when we say strangers everywhere,
is it my speakers here?
We are proposing to be brothers everywhere.
But here he is giving his speech, meeting with people. on the
You could call it a
Vaporetto.
Pope-mobile on the water. And the Pope met this morning
busy
with detainees at the Giudecca's women prison and visited the Holy See's pavilion at the 60th International Art Exhibition, or commonly known as the Venice Art Biennale.
Lots of people there. He's coming in and his little buggy speeded it up a bit.
And Pope Francis is
reading another speech.
But for those who are alone, color the world with your creativity and paint the streets of life with the gospel. Please, paint the streets of life with the gospel. Arise and go. Let's say together.
This is at St. Mark. There you go. So he looks alive and well to me. I don't know what you think. But I think that sort of really speaks against that narrative that we've got here from these guys, you know, and obviously there is a lot of speculation about the Pope's health, which is understandable given his age and, you know, various complaints, illnesses and one thing or another that he's got. But I would say, let's not pay too much attention to that. It goes on. Vatican nerves are always on the edge in the final years of the pontificate. In the case of the conservative Benedict XVI, they were overshadowed by leaks gleefully reported by hostile media, revealing flamboyant corruption at the top of the Roman Curia, the government of the Holy See. Benedict was too frightened to act and resigned in despair. We think that's obviously what Damien thinks about it, so we don't know that. Now, the Vatican is once again paralysed by scandals, but this time round, correspondents working for secular and Catholic outlets are trying to protect Francis, who faces more serious questions about his personal conduct than any pope in living memory. This is absolutely accurate. For years, allegations that would torpedo the career of any secular Western leader have been cancelled or played down by a Praetorian Guard of liberal journalists who back in 2013 staked their reputations on the Great Reformer. Obviously, that's the title of Austin Ivory's book. As a result, even devout Catholics don't know that the first Jesuit Pope has tried to shield several repulsive sex abusers from justice for reasons never satisfactorily explained. Only now is the truth coming out, to the relief of Vatican staff who have had to deal with a Pope who bears little resemblance to the wisecracking, avuncular figure they see on television. They are, or were until recently, terrified of a boss whose autocratic rule is shaped more by his rages and simmering resentments than by any theological agenda. And they can't conceal their satisfaction that one particularly gruesome scandal involving papal ally Father Marco Rupnik is stripping away the facade of the Squid Game pontificate, as it's nicknamed after the South Korean Netflix series in which contestants have to win children's games to save themselves from execution. And that's a new one on me. I haven't heard it called the Squid Game pontificate, but I get where it's coming from. The Rupnik affair is the most sickening scandal I've encountered in more than 30 years of reporting on the Catholic Church. Rupnik, a supremely well-connected artist on whose tacky mosaics the Church has spent hundreds of thousands of pounds, was expelled from the Jesuit order last year after he was credibly accused of raping religious sisters belonging to a community he founded in his native Slovenia. Women have come forward complaining that the community was a sex cult. They say he tried to force them to watch pornographic films. I'm not going to say that. Next bit, violently took... Yeah, right. So there's some nasty things there. And there are links there to the proof, if you like. So, yeah, it's nasty. Last year, facing an explosion of rage on Catholic social media, mainstream media was strangely silent. Pope Francis said that he would act against his friend Rupnik. He has not done so, nor has he explained why, when Rupnik was facing excommunication for abusing the confessional to absolve one of his female sex victims, he was invited to conduct a retreat at the Vatican, or why his subsequent excommunication was mysteriously lifted within weeks with the approval of the Pope. I mean, it really is unbelievable that this guy is still out there. And I have to say I feel a bit powerless because I just can't believe that this is a thing and that no one seems to be able to hold the Pope to account. And I suppose the only thing that can hold the Pope to account is the media. And if all the Catholic press focused on this and all the secular press, then it'd have to do something about it. But in the meantime, what's going on? Absolutely nothing. This month, Father Rupnik so this is absolutely unbelievable, right? This month, Father Rupnik was listed in the 2024 Vatican Directory as a consultant on divine worship, right? Given what he's been doing, this is what he's been doing, liturgical abuse, but actually abusing people in the liturgy. He's been listed as a consultant on divine worship, of all things. Meanwhile, Bishop Daniele Libanori, the Jesuit who investigated the women's claims and found them credible, has been removed from his position as an auxiliary bishop in the Diocese of Rome. Now, that is a new thing that I wasn't aware of, so it's just awful. Another toxic scandal is still unfolding in Argentina. So I've written about the Rupnik thing in the Catholic Herald. The Zanchetta thing is something I've been following for ages, and you can find lots of articles if you post Zanchetta into my blog, De Omnibus Dubitandum Est. So basically, this is his best mate, right, from Argentina, and he was the guy we put in charge. He was like the secretary of the Bishops' Conference when Jorge Bergoglio was like in charge. He was the president of the Bishops' Conference. And as soon as he was made Pope, as soon as he was elected Pope, he made Zanchetta a bishop. And the problems unfolded from there, basically, because this guy is super dodgy. The former Cardinal Bergoglio's most pampered protege had to resign from the Diocese of Oran after he was accused of financial corruption and aggressive attempts to seduce seminarians. The Pope's response? He airlifted Zanchetta to Rome and invented a job for him, assessor of the funds managed by the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, APSA, which is the Vatican Treasury. Zanchetta was later convicted of assaulting seminarians, even though Rome refused to supply documents requested by the Argentinian court. He's serving his jail sentence in a retreat house amid reports that his accusers are being harassed. So he's basically under house arrest. The story is coming back to haunt Francis, I hope it does, whose enemies, emboldened by his loosening grip on the government of the Holy See, are circulating extremely damaging documents. These suggest that the Pope is even more tangled up in the scandal than previously suspected. And there are other cases. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Francis unsuccessfully attempted to keep the child molester, Father Giulio Grassi, out of jail, commissioning a report that branded his victims as liars. And that's something that he's done before. He did it in another case. The dark secrets of this pontificate will weigh heavily on cardinals' minds in their pre-conclave discussions before they cast their votes in the Sistine Chapel. They will be speaking in code. No one wants to take the risk of openly trashing the reputation of a recently deceased or retired Supreme Pontiff, but the cardinals will be forced to talk about the increasingly poisonous divisions between liberal and conservative Catholics, which date back to the Second Vatican Council, but have been made far worse under this pontificate. And they will find it hard to draw a line between Francis's policies and his personality, since he takes such a visible delight in using his powers to spring surprises on the universal church. When Francis first took office, most cardinals shared the popular enthusiasm for his informal style, his preference to be known as plain Bishop of Rome, and his abandonment of some of the more comical trappings of his office, such as the red shoes. But they quickly discovered that this informal pope, in contrast to his predecessors, liked to rule through executive fiat. Francis has issued a torrent of papal rulings known as motu proprios, literally of his own accord. More than 60 so far, 6 times more frequently than John Paul II. They have made massive changes to liturgy, finance, government, and canon law. They often land without warning and can be brutal. The Pope has used this mechanism to seize control of the Order of Malta, for example, and to strip away the privileges of the secretive but ultra-loyal organisation Opus Dei. So he's attacked Opus Dei, and it's really hard because Opus Dei have got this policy where they don't criticise the hierarchy. And it's a beautiful thing, really. It's something that's based on Jesus and Jesus's approach to the Pharisees in John's Gospel. I'm just going to look it up for you. quickly. So it's in Matthew 23, where Jesus says, they make a big show of wearing scripture verses in their foreheads that they love the best seats at the banquets and the front seats in their synagogues. And when they are in market, they like to have people greet them as their teachers. None of you should be called the leader. Whoever is the greatest be the servant. Let's share this tab. So there you go. The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. So there you go. So in that vein, Opus Dei very graciously hold to this teaching, and they refuse to criticize the people who have been given the power, in the church, the bishops. But at the same time, Pope Francis has attacked them because they're quite wealthy and they've got a lot of power, and because they've got a lot of followers, because they've been preaching the gospel. So it's a difficult juggling act, I would imagine, especially for Opus Dei to manage. And I know that privately, lots of Opus Dei clergy are absolutely appalled with everything that's going on, but they won't, no one's going to speak out about it, which is why I am. One of the reasons why I'm speaking out about it. Okay, two rulings above all have traumatised the conservative Catholics for whom Francis nurtures a pathological dislike, rarely missing an opportunity to point out their rigidity or to mock their traditional vestments decorated with what he calls grandmother's lace. This first is his decision issued via motu proprio to crush the celebration of the pre-1970 Latin Mass that Benedict had carefully reintegrated into the worship of the Church. In 2021, a decision that he knew would cause his retired predecessor terrible pain, Francis effectively banned its celebration in ordinary parishes. Only a tiny proportion of the world's 1.3 billion Catholics attend the old rite masses, so why has the ban turned into such a big deal? Partly it's a reflection of the Cromwellian thoroughness with which it has been enforced by Francis's new liturgy chief, Cardinal Arthur Roche, the most powerful English cleric in Rome, a native of Batley, with the manner of self-important Yorkshire alderman. Roche has evolved into that familiar Roman beast, an authoritarian liberal with a nose for the juiciest saltimbocca alla romana and the fluffiest tiramisu. This year, Damien really doesn't like Cardinal Roche, and he's made that clear over lots of different articles. He's got this particular style and way of attacking him, hasn't he? This year, he forced his old rival, Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster, to ban the old rite Holy Week ceremonies in his diocese. And that does seem to be the case because he basically rung up and he'd seen some pictures of the old rite in Westminster Cathedral, and I heard from the cathedral that he'd rung up and I've gone, why have you got the old rite mass? So Vincent Nichols unfortunately had to ban it. I don't think Vincent Nichols is particularly fond of the old rite mass, but the fact of the matter is that, in Westminster Archdiocese, which is Cardinal Nichols is obviously the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, which is like the main London, north of the river, the main diocese. There are so many priests who celebrate the old rite that Nichols would be in trouble if he actually pulled the plug on it completely. But it's interesting to see this sort of power play where he's having to play this game with Cardinal Roche. My friend Anna bought me this book for my birthday, and I've just finished reading it. And I wouldn't recommend it really because it's quite turgid, quite a lot of it. But there is some quite good stuff at the end in the last couple of chapters. And basically, it says, with regards to Traditionis Custodes, which is Pope Francis's restriction on the on the traditional Latin Mass. It confirms that Benedict did think that Traditionis Custodes was a mistake, especially because he thought that forbidding the traditional Latin Mass in parish churches would shove a group of the faithful into a corner, making them feel persecuted and putting them in a position where they feel they have to safeguard their own identity from someone who they perceive to be an enemy. And you have to say that is, where Traditionis Custodes has led us so far. So, okay, so moving on to the next bit. The British Conservative peer Lord Moylan, a traditionalist Catholic, vented his fury on a post on X. I heard a wonderful Tridentine morning mass this evening. I shan't tell you where it was in case Arthur sends his henchmen round. I'll just say that English Catholicism has centuries-old tradition of underground masses. All that has changed is who's persecuting us. Who would have ever thought we'd be in a position where it was the Pope and the head of the Congregation for Worship? I mean, it's just backwards, isn't it? Many bishops aren't keen on the intricately choreographed Latin ceremonies, but what they dislike far more is having their arms twisted by a pope who, while telling the world that he's empowering bishops by encouraging synodality, whatever that means, is undermining their pastoral authority over their parishes. Well, I think it's important that we say that synodality is basically Cardinal Martini, who was the guy who came up with the St. Gallen Mafia and died before the last conclave. That was his quite clever way of changing the future of the church. We don't have to have Vatican III. We don't have to have another big council where we declare things. He wanted this sort of quiet manipulation, this never-ending synodality to go on in the background. So that's what synodality is. Whatever they're trying to tell you it is, that's what the idea is. And you can sort of gather that from the rhetoric coming out of the Synod Office as well, under the bozo from Gozo, Cardinal Grech. We'll get on to him. But even this controversy pales in comparison with the explosion of rage from half the world's bishops when, just before Christmas, without warning or consultation, the Pope signed Fiducia Supplicans, a document allowing priests to bless gay couples. This time his chosen instrument was a declaration from the Church's Doctrine Office, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, that same-sex couples or people in other irregular situations could receive non-liturgical blessings from priests. This was amazing because as recently as 2021, the same office had condemned the notion of same-sex couples. Also, no one had ever heard of a non-liturgical blessing. It did not exist in canon law. So who came up with that idea? Well, it's just a liturgical nonsense because, if you're being asked for a blessing as a priest, whose blessing are you being asked for? Yours as someone who can do magic, or the church's as someone who stands in persona Christi? So it's obviously liturgical. It's obviously an act of liturgy because you're asking for the blessing of the church. So who came up with that idea? Stepped forward the new prefect of the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Victor Tucho Fernandez, the most eccentric of the Pope's Argentinian protégés. It's hard to exaggerate the weirdness of appointing Fernandez to the head of the DDF. He was best known for writing a book on the theology of kissing until it was discovered that he'd also written one about the theology of orgasms, containing passages so disturbing that Tucho himself had second thoughts and apparently tried to hide all the existing copies. How could this embarrassing lightweight come to occupy an office previously held by Benedict XVI, who, as Joseph Ratzinger, was arguably the greatest Catholic theologian of the 20th century? One theory is that Fernandez wasn't Francis's first choice, but the name of his preferred candidate. The German progressive Bishop Heimer Wilmer was leaked, so he picked someone else. As soon as he was in office, Tucho wrote Fiducia Supplicans and slipped it onto Francis's desk without showing it to other senior cardinals. So this is the idea that the most thing that Francis doesn't want is to be second-guessed by anyone. So if he thinks that we are saying, oh, he's going to do this and we know why he's going to do it, in other words, if we suss out his agenda, then he changes tack and he does something else. And I think, through discussions with people that I know, that Wilmer would probably have been a better choice because he wouldn't have acted in the rash way that Fernandez has. And I have to say that when Fiducia Supplicans came out, the Church of England here in the UK were having these discussions about is it okay to bless same-sex couples? That was the irony, and they were very carefully arguing it out and having all kinds of wrangling. And I was following the discussion quite closely because it was interesting. It was obviously they were using scripture, and some people were invoking Cardinal St. John Henry Newman's development of doctrine falsely. They were mangling it all. Fernandez does that in Fiducia Supplicans as well. And basically, we leapfrogged over the top of them. Fiducia Supplicans leapfrogged over the top of them. And it contains a certain amount of doublespeak. So it says you can and you can't, basically. So, which means that if you say that he can do it, he will undoubtedly, appeal to another part of the document that says you can't. But the fact of the matter is that we've had an actual gay marriage take place just this week in a church in Chicago, which is Cardinal Superch's place. And he basically is saying that, well, they've basically married someone, two ladies, and you have to wonder whether, let me just see if I can pull that up for you. So here's a report of it. Chicago passed that. Now, this is very much in the mould of Cardinal Supich that this has gone on, that this guy, Cardinal Supich has got a reputation for attacking Orthodox pastors and promoting liberal ones. So it will be interesting to see if the Archdiocese takes any action over this. But it will be also interesting to see if Cardinal Fernandez takes any action over this. We'll see. The proof of the pudding will be in the baking, won't it, as they say. So we'll find out whether he means it or not. But it certainly seems that way. The fallout was spectacular from that document. There was already a growing rift between Catholic bishops led by German and American progressives who thought it was okay to bless same-sex couples, and those who thought it made a mockery of the teachings of Christ. After Fiducia, that rift seems irreparable. On the 11th of January, the bishops of West, East and Central Africa jointly announced that they do not consider it appropriate for Africa to bless homosexual unions or same-sex couples. Francis, unpredictable as ever, then said it was fine because they were Africans, thus throwing Tucho under the bus, opening himself up to accusations of racism and offending the LGBT lobby. Gay rights activists were already mortified by a panicky Vatican clarification of January the 4th, stating that the blessings of same-sex couples would last a maximum of 15 seconds and were not an endorsement of the lives they had. So just absolute doublespeak coming out of the Vatican. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, wounded by papal overtures to Putin, said Fiducia didn't apply to them either. Likewise, the Polish Church, most recently the Coptic Orthodox Church, has taken the drastic step of suspending theological dialogue with Rome. So it's a complete disaster. Hagon Loye, make a mess, was the new Pope's message to young Catholics in 2013. What did he mean? All his words are drenched in ambiguity. Perhaps it's explained by his statement that the Church always does what good she can, even if the process, her shoes get soiled by the mud of the street. But Fiducia Supplicans smells like an accidental mess, not a calculated risk. It's something you scrape off your shoe because you weren't looking where you were going. Had the Pope taken leave of his senses? He is one of the most complicated men I have ever met, says a Vatican source who has been observing the Pope closely for a decade. He can be terrific fun and also incredibly vengeful. If you cross him, he'll kick you when you're at your lowest ebb. But don't get the idea that he's a master strategist. He's a clumsy tactician who spends his time lighting and putting out fires. His number one priority, overriding everything else, is that he should be inscrutable. He doesn't want anyone to know what he's planning to do, and if you find out, he'll do the opposite, even if it disrupts his plans. I think that is really interesting insight from someone in the Vatican. First of all, this idea that he is a clumsy tactician who goes around lighting and putting out fires, which is very much what I have seen from the way that the Pope operates. It's not very clear what direction he's heading in, but there are these grand overarching strategies, one of which is synodality, which is obviously, as I've said, part of Cardinal Martini's plan to push the church in a more progressive direction, and to do that by means of these ongoing discussions. But it's interesting that we've seen very much that if it doesn't work through synodality, then he uses his autocratic style and just makes it happen anyway. And that's what we got with Fiducia Supplicans, where the reports were that this idea, if you like, of non-liturgical blessings for irregular couples in irregular circumstances was put forward to the synod, and it was rejected roundly. So as a result of that, they just went ahead and pushed it through in any case. So, Damien goes on then to explain what, another example of that. My source does not belong to any clerical faction, and his assessments of how people tend to be conspicuously gentle. It's been interesting to watch how, during our meetings in Rome over the past 5 years, his opinion of Francis has hardened to the point where he unhesitatingly describes him as a nasty man. If Francis cancels any plan anticipated by the media, then that helps explain the disaster of Fiducia Supplicans. Bishop Wilmot is probably more heterodox than Cardinal Fernandez on the subject of homosexuality, but he would never have put his name to Tucho's amateur doodlings, as one critic describes the document. Now, this is a very important point. I think, in a way, this is another way in which Fiducia Supplicans has helped us. So the first way, remember, is that it has brought together the anti-Francis, like the anti-same-sex attraction bloc, and made it clear that this is a big part of his agenda. And again, this was a massive part of the St. Gala Mafia agenda and Cardinal Martini. This is what we know they wanted to push through. And it's probably because they've got this idea of sexuality as like a peccadillo, like a minor sin where, it's sort of something that everyone's subject to. And this comes out of the some of the, I'm sitting here. I mean, I don't know how many people, sit down to do a podcast with moral theology books, but without getting into the really complex sort of terminology of Veritatis Splendor, like which goes through some of those problems that they were wrestling with just around the time of the Second Vatican Council. But you've got a series of situation ethics and strategies like fundamental principle, which basically say that your actions aren't necessarily morally evil. And obviously this contradicts everything that Scripture teaches us and everything the Church has taught us. And it seems that there's a lobby of men in the Vatican who are desperately seeking to relativize the idea of objective sin and our actions, probably because they're engaged in problematic actions themselves, if you know what I mean. Okay, so basically that this is what was that we've been fighting against in the Church, and I can't see that it could possibly work, because if you understand anything about the way that this is not something that's man-made, the prohibition against sexual acts outside of marriage, fundamentally that's what the Church comes down to. When it condemns sodomy, for example, it condemns it among a man and a woman. I think the majority of cases statistically are between a man and a woman. It just rejects the asexuality of that, because our sexuality has been given to us for procreative reasons. And obviously when you get into those sorts of things, there are psychological dimensions to it, because you're using someone else for gratification. And that's not, I don't think that should be underestimated either, rather than, there's a real sacred joining together of people if you follow what the Church teaches about it. Now, it's really it's complicated, and it's incredibly delicate as well. So it deserves a lot more attention and respect than I can give it in this particular video. So I'm going to just move on, but that's just an overview there of whatever. Like, if we separate the procreative and unitive ends of marriage and divide the two things, then basically the whole thing falls to bits. And that should be fairly obvious if you think about it, but anyway. But note how quickly the Pope switched into reverse gear. A book just published by the French conservative Catholic Jean-Pierre Moreau, portrays Jorge Bergoglio as a liberal iconoclast inspired by quasi-Marxist liberation theology. I think that's wrong, and he is what he's always been, a Peronist. Like Juan Perón, the populist president of Argentina during his childhood, he is more interested in power than ideas. No Vatican source talks of Francis's powerful charm, his way of making you think you're the only person who matters. They say the same thing about Perón, a consummate opportunist who, at the height of his powers, won simultaneous support from neo-Nazis and Marxists, but who also took pleasure in lashing out unexpectedly at allies and opponents alike. It is quite extraordinary, this parallel with Juan Perón. And why you would model your behaviour on that, I really don't know. But I think if you look at, another source of information about Pope Francis, as I've mentioned in several other videos, is the Aparecida document. And you can see that liberation theology influence coming through in that sort of text as well. But there is a parallel with Peronism, this preference for the poor. It's sort of it's a preference for the poor used to manipulate political power, I would say, rather than actual genuine concern. Perhaps the Pope has more actual genuine concern for the poor, please God. But it's sort of, as we're on Catholic Unscripted, I think we've done a good job of explaining how there's a concern that it puts the hierarchy of truths out of kilter, and that our hierarchy of truths should be on doing God's will, really. That's, and as Jesus says, the poor be with us always. But yes, absolutely, we serve the poor, but not at the cost of higher truths. Again, it's another complicated issue, but this is all part of the rich puzzle of this papacy. And I think thinking about these things helps us to understand how they all fit together. It's dangerous when we just say, oh, Francis is a communist or whatever. I don't think that's helpful at all. And he's definitely a nuanced character, and it helps to see these influences. What is absolutely correct in this assessment, I think, is the fact that he is definitely more interested in power than faith, than, the Catholic faith. And that really makes me sad. But that is what I see. And, it's also what I read. And obviously the Pope's brought out his own sort of answer to this book in Spanish not long after, which is very clearly an attack on Ganswein and Sarah and, these cardinals. It's a shot across their bows, warning them that if they continue telling the truth like this, then Pope Francis knows some truths as well, and that they'll come out. So I've never known it so open, this power play and the threats, and it's not it doesn't strike me as very Christian. But let's be honest, what do we expect? If the devil is going to attack the good, the true and the beautiful, where's his attack going to be most effective? And that's what we're seeing at the moment. And I'm hoping for a Pope who prays more and speaks less in the next pontificate. What an extraordinary situation. It really is an extraordinary situation that we're in at the moment, isn't it? Okay, so the next bit. Ideologically, Peronism is all over the place, but it has always been committed to social welfare and also passionately anti-American. And some people have had a go at me on Catholic Unscripted for pointing out the fact that Pope Francis is he is obviously anti-American. If you're paying any attention whatsoever, he's consistently attacked the church in America and Americans and America's role. And, he clearly doesn't like America. Two enduring strands in Francis' thinking, exactly. During John Paul II's pontificate, Bergoglio stressed his theological orthodoxy, earning the hatred of some of his fellow Jesuits, but he always disliked meticulous ceremonies. There's footage of him virtually throwing the Blessed Sacrament into a crowd in Buenos Aires, and when you watch him yawning his way through ceremonies at St. Peter's, you can't help wondering if he finds Mass boring. He no longer celebrates it in public, and the excuse that he's always too ill to do so doesn't work. John Paul II said Mass even when crippled by Parkinson's and really and barely able to speak. And that is something that really bothers me, the fact that the Pope doesn't celebrate Mass anymore. On the evening Francis was elected, the traditionalist website Rorata Caeli published a cry of anguish from Marcelo Gonzalez, a journalist in Buenos Aires. It was headed "The Horror" and described the self-effacing figure who had just walked out onto the balcony of St. Peter's as the worst of all thinkable candidates. Bergoglio was a sworn enemy of the traditional Mass, who had persecuted every single priest who made an effort to wear a cassock. Like most observers, I thought the article was over the top, and like most observers, I was wrong. Gonzalez was proved right about the Latin Mass, and also about cassocks. These days, ambitious priests in Rome know that the swish of the soutane could land them in a miserable curacy, so now they scuttle across the piazzas in drab clerical suits. But is Francis really a liberal? The fact that he loathes conservatives doesn't mean he supports women's ordination. He doesn't, and one shouldn't read too much into the occasional photo up with an LGBT Catholic. Gossips in the Curia suggest that when the Holy Father lets his guard down and slips into scatological Buenos Aires slang, he's not especially complimentary about the gays or some other minorities. It's hard to explain the prominence of gay clergy in his entourage, both in Argentina and Rome. This is a really good bit because it gets all this right, I think, very much. It says that there is an extraordinary prominence of gay clergy in his entourage. He does seem to favour, the LGBT agenda in an extraordinary way. And even though the documents that are coming out are sort of speak contradictory to that in many ways, some of them are just self-contradictory, like Fiducia Supplicans, but you've got this strange sort of juxtaposition there. And this next bit really explains why. And it's an interesting theory. I think it's a theory that's got legs as well. It says, both in Argentina and Rome, the prominence of the gay clergy. Given that no one ever suggested that Jorge Bergoglio, the former nightclub bouncer who had a girlfriend before he entered seminary, is homosexual, but he knows whose closets contain skeletons. So this is the idea that what Francis does is he finds people he can manipulate, people who've got skeletons in their closets, so that he can have some information that would destroy them. So you can imagine if you had a bishop who had a homosexual relationship, for example, you could promote them, you're putting them in the limelight, you're putting them in the focus of the public, and you let them know that you know what's going on behind the scenes, and that gives you power over them because you've got the power there to expose them and totally destroy them and just take away their livelihood and their position and their rank and everything at any moment. So they sort of owe everything to you and they have to do what they're told. One priest in Rome told me when Bergoglio visited Rome in the old days, he'd park himself among the other visitors at the Casa del Clero, absorbing the gossip, much of which was about gay clergy, and he wouldn't forget it. The Casa is where Francis went back to settle his bill after his election and made sure there were cameras set up to record his humility. Of course, the future Pope wasn't alone in gathering information in this way. Latin American politics, clerical as well as secular, has always been oiled by the exchange of secrets, and nowhere more so than in Argentina, where 2/3 of citizens have some Italian ancestry and political horse trading has a distinctly Italian flavour. It's important that we remember that this is a man who's lived his life in this environment. He was in high office in Buenos Aires. He, was by all reports very political in the way that he ran that office as well. I was told by one denizen of Buenos Aires, a Catholic, that he was only interested in power when he was there. That was all he was interested in. And because of that, he was seen as a political enemy by the people, the politicians in charge. So I think this is someone who is well versed in this modus operandi and very polished at it. So even though he may not be particularly intelligent or have a wonderful or complex strategy. He has got the St. Garland strategy, which is the one that got him elected, and he's pursuing that. Somewhat clumsily, lighting his fires and putting out his fires, stumbling about. But the methodology that his personality has developed for gaining information and manipulating people, I think that is sort of fairly cut and dried, that's a real thing. Continuing, perhaps it was naive of the cardinals in 2013 to expect the former Cardinal Bergoglio to clean up the corruption that had driven Benedict XVI to the state of helpless despair in which he resigned his office. But that was the main reason they elected him. He promised pest control, and it was a promise that he didn't keep. Maybe the cardinal should have taken a closer look at 2 retired cardinals who were acting as his unofficial campaign managers. So this is probably information that we all know, but it's worthwhile being reminded. The American Theodore McCarrick and the Belgian Godfried de Niels were both in disgrace, having been caught trying to lie their way out of sex scandals. Right? Like, this is well documented before any of this happened, before the papacy happened. McCarrick's assaults on seminarians have been an open secret in the American church for decades, while de Niels had already been caught attempting to cover up incestuous child abuse by one of his bishops. Francis immediately rehabilitated both of them, and that was bragged that the National Catholic Reporter bragged about that. You can, again, that's on my blog, if you want to read more about it. McCarrick resumed his role as the Pope's emissary and fundraiser, though Francis eventually had to defrock him when he was charged with child abuse. De Niels, incredibly, received the papal invitation to the Synod on the Family. That was extraordinary. Meanwhile, Francis's financial reforms began promisingly. He created the new job of prefect for the economy for the late Cardinal George Pell, a no-nonsense Australian conservative. Pell stumbled across gigantic money-laundering operations involving senior Curia officials, whereupon he was conveniently forced to resign to face trumped-up charges of child abuse in Melbourne. God rest Cardinal Pell. We should all say a prayer for him because he was a great man. During Pell's long, ultimately successful battle to clear his name, Francis inexplicably gave free rein to Archbishop Angelo Becciu, who was already suspected of having his hand in numerous tills. I've written a blog about this called Francis Backs the Wrong Horse Again, which just, when he picked Becciu out to do this, I just couldn't believe that. It sort of seemed like the most dodgy person possible to have picked. Becciu took the opportunity to sack Libero Merlone, the independent auditor appointed by Pell, threatening to throw him into jail, into a Vatican cell for the crime of spying, in other words, doing his job. And eventually, Becciu himself was sacked after the discovery of billions of dollars poured into dodgy investments, at which point, very oddly, Francis made him a cardinal. And he remains one today, despite losing most of his cardinal's privileges in 2020 after he was charged, along with 9 others, with embezzlement. He was found guilty and now faces 5.5 years in jail, but no one thinks he'll serve them because he knows too much. Yet, not everyone with access to damaging information has been promoted. Bishop Nunzio Galatino was president of APSA when Zanchetta was hiding there in the non-job of assessor. Okay, so we got this. He expected to be made a cardinal when he retired. He wasn't, and he's reportedly furious. So remember, Zanchetta is Francis's mate from Argentina, who was made a bishop when Pope Francis was made Pope. He overrode all the canonical process to get him made a bishop, and then he was charged with abuse and is now in house arrest. So that was earlier in the article. This month I was sent a 500-page dossier on Zanchetta. So this bit kind of makes you think he's linking Bishop Nunzio Galantino with this 500-page dossier, which I don't know how wise that is, but it seems to me that what he's saying here is, there are people, Francis has made enemies. He's not managed to buy everyone. And here's an example. So Damien was sent a 500-page dossier on Zanchetta. Many of the stomach-churning details of the allegations of the sexual exploitation of seminarians have never been reported. I was also sent a photocopy of a document purporting to show that diocesan officials from Iran accused Zanchetta of hiding the sale of properties that funded the building of his seminary. It displays the signatures and stamps of the officials. Allegedly, Zanchetta claimed that Pope Francis himself had advised him to conceal the transactions. A leading Catholic blog reported this claim in 2022. The mainstream media did not. I showed the photocopy to a very senior Vatican official who replied via WhatsApp. And that Catholic blog is the Catholic Culture blog. I had heard of this matter as a rumour, but now I see it in black and white. However hideous the scandals associated with this pontificate, it's likely that they will influence the next conclave as much as the documents signed by Francis on 18th of December last year. So this is a brilliant bit now. We're moving into the politics of the conclave. And this is really well written by Damien and absolutely correct, I'd say. And it's talking about the massive, massive mess that Francis has made of his own stacking of the conclave, which he has undoubtedly done, and everyone's been saying he's been stuffing it. But first of all, there's this thing of going out to the peripheries, which Francis has been on about from the beginning. I mean, you don't hear so much about it now, but certainly at the beginning, wasn't it? It was all about the decentralization of power and going out to the peripheries. He kept going on about that. And he got into a lot of trouble because he was making cardinals and appointing bishops in, the peripheries, as he saw the peripheries. And a lot of them were rubbish because, he's giving red hats to people who are in charge of tiny little Catholic communities. And they've just not really got any relevance. And they don't understand what's going on in the church. And then he stopped consistories, so he hasn't had any gatherings of the cardinals. That's a really interesting move. Why would you do that? So they haven't had a chance to talk to each other and get to know each other and to discuss what's going on in the church. And then you've got the element of Cardinal Pell, who, before he died, was writing to all of these guys to let them know exactly what was going on and why we shouldn't ever think about having another Pope Francis II. So this bit is really important because this is even whatever Francis has put in place to sort of make sure that he gets what he wants out of the next conclave after his death, God forbid, that has failed. This basically explains that that's failed. And he says, Fiducia Supplicans changed the dynamics of the Electoral College, not just because it forced Catholic bishops to address the radioactive topic of homosexuality that has torn apart the Protestant churches, but also because it summed up the catastrophic incompetence of this pontificate. And that is the radioactive topic of homosexuality is right. As a priest in my diocese said to me, no one's going to touch that. When I was saying how important it is that this is what all the kids are talking about, we don't understand why the church takes this position and, it needs to be spelt out to the people. But no one wants to do that, sadly. At least 3/4 of the future cardinal electors will have been appointed by Francis, so you might think that the conclave, while recognising Fiducia Supplicans as a blunder, will be looking for a pope who supports Francis's relatively undogmatic approach to issues of human sexuality. And so it might be if he'd created enough liberal cardinals, but he hasn't. And I mean, again, this is interesting, isn't it? That you'd have thought that being able to elect 3/4 of the cardinal electors would put him in a position where it was cast iron. I mean, if he was any kind of strategist, this speaks against the fact that he's any kind of master strategist, doesn't it? In the early years of his reign, Pope Francis adopted a tribal approach, especially in the United States. It was as if he was playing a Peronist ball game, moving red hats to unlikely sees occupied by Bergoglian loyalists. Newark, New Jersey, acquired its first cardinal, Joseph Tobin, who's a Redemptorist. He had been close to... Now, the Redemptorists were always fire and brimstone years and years ago, but they're extremely liberal today. And Joe Tobin is... oh, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. Joe Tobin is quite clever, but he's also made some incredible mistakes. This is Joe Tobin of Nighty Night Baby. You might have heard that he sent a text and he had this Italian model living in his house with him and, just scandal after scandal, really. So Joseph Tobin had been close to Ted McCarrick Los Angeles was punished for having an Orthodox bishop, Jose Gomez, who really had his nose rubbed in it. And this is another really good point. Again, we've covered all of this extensively. Instead of becoming the first Hispanic cardinal, he had to watch the honour go to his uber-liberal suffragan, Robert McElroy of San Diego, who is just an absolute disaster. And I mean, there's arguments that he shouldn't even be a priest, let alone a bishop, let alone a cardinal. He's accused of ignoring warnings about Ted McCarrick's predatory habits. Chicago got a red hat, as is customary, but it landed on the head of the aggressively left-wing Blaise Supich, needless to say, a Francis appointee. And part of the whole thing that's going on in America, as it's been relayed to me, is that Supich, who was the favoured Dauphin of Pope Francis, and that's left a lot of people very nervous. I think it looks like he had promised Francis that he would deliver the United States Bishops' Conference, and he's failed miserably in doing that. So as a result, Francis is now running out of time and he's lost patience. So elsewhere in the world, Francis adopted a policy of appointing cardinals from the peripheries. Mongolia's 1,400, so this is what I was saying a minute ago. Mongolia's 1,450 Catholics have one. Australia's 5 million Catholics don't. Tonga has one. Ireland doesn't. But by doing so, he had to abandon his game of boosting liberals and twisting the tail of his conservative critics. What is that all about? Why on earth would he appoint a cardinal in Mongolia and not in Australia? I mean, it really does. It beggars belief, doesn't it? These factional labels don't mean much in the developing world. In the last two consistories, he's created 33 cardinals, only a handful of whom have Western-style radical views on sexuality. To quote one Vatican analyst, Francis has wasted his chance to firmly stack the deck for the next conclave, and now the college is full. Even if he lives to call another consistory, he won't have many places to play him. The new cardinals tick various Bergoglian boxes. They relish the Pope's attacks on free market capitalism and his melodramatic warnings about climate change. None of them is a right-wing traditionalist, and until recently no one paid much attention to their ferocious views on sodomy. Now, those views really matter. To quote the same analyst, when Fiducia Supplicans was published, the African cardinals ditched their Francis worship overnight. The vast majority won't vote for anyone who has backed Fiducia. Now, there are currently 17 African cardinal electors. Nearly all of them are in the anti-gay bloc. To these, we can add at least 10 cardinals from Asia, Latin America, and the West who share their views, even if they use milder rhetoric. Under current rules, a pope must be elected by 2/3 majority of the cardinal electors. This means that social conservatives, if they join forces with the significant number of moderates alarmed by Fiducia, can block anyone seen as progressive on homosexuality. That's bad news for Cardinal Luis Tagle, the ambitious former Archbishop of Manila. He was once dubbed the Asian Francis on account of his showmanship and socially liberal views. In 2019, Francis put him in charge of worldwide evangelization, a huge prize that was snatched away when the Pope restructured his department and sacked him as head of Caritas, the Catholic aid agency, dogged by sex abuse scandals. So, I mean, that's old news. I think Tagle was really did seem high on the Pope's list of favoured cardinals, but that was quite some time ago now, and Tagle seems to be well out of favour, as is Supich. So it's also tricky for Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, the affable bicycling beanpole, who's the Archbishop of Bologna. His politics are socialist, no problem for developing world bishops, and during Benedict XVI's reign, he developed an enthusiasm for the old liturgy, even learning how to celebrate the Tridentine Mass. All that shows is that he's a bit of a flip-flopper, that he'll go with, the zeitgeist, the ecclesial zeitgeist. His stance on homosexuality is cautious. I would say it's pro, but he allowed a gay couple to have a church blessing in his diocese and then disastrously had his spokesman basically lie about it, claiming it wasn't a same-sex blessing, when it obviously was. Zuppi isn't a fan of Fiducia Supplicans, who is, but at the moment he'd run up against the blocking third. Zuppi is, I've heard, someone that the Italians would be happy with, even though he is a liberal. So he's one to watch, I think, definitely. Hardline liberals stand even less of a chance. Blaise Supich of Chicago isn't Paper Bile, nor are the McCarrick boys. Tobin, McElroy, Gregory, Farrell, or the veteran European leftists Hollerich, Marx, and Cezanne. So, I'm sure you know who Tobin we've done, Supich we've done, Wilton Gregory, Bishop of DC, who has been speaking out a little bit recently, but basically he's the guy who's in charge of telling Joe Tobin he's going to hell, Joe Biden, that he's going to hell if he doesn't mend his ways on abortion, and he's not doing a great job of that, is he? Farrell, I always think Farrell's really interesting. He's the guy who lived with McCarrick for like 5 years or something, and when he was asked if he knew anything about all his abuse and sleeping with boys and all that, he was like, no, don't know anything about it. He's also he was a what's it called, the army of, I can't remember now, and it's terrible when you get old and you lose your memory. The scandalized fraternity of priests, I can't remember. Anyway, he's a member of that. Maciel was the guy who ran it. Someone will tell me in the notes, I'm sure. Shall I just look it up? Should we just do a cut, Catherine, and I'll look it up? Hang on. Maciel. Right. So I'll just go from where I tried to say the name. Sorry to do this to you and make you cut it. So Farrell, who is the Camerlengo at the moment, unbelievably, so he's certainly got some favour with Francis, but he lived with ex-Cardinal McCarrick. He lived with him for 5 years, and when he was asked if he knew anything about his nefarious activity, he said, no, didn't have a clue. I was really surprised when all that came out. And if you know anything about clergy, it's very difficult to imagine that he didn't know absolutely everything about him after living with him for 5 years. He was also a member of the Legionaries of Christ, which is a defunct organisation, which was headed up by an extremely abusive Catholic priest called Marcial Maciel. It's very controversial. A lot of people think that the whole thing should have been disbanded after the scandal broke, but it hasn't been. So anyway, he's got, he really is interesting and dodgy. I'd like to know more about what goes on with him. The veteran European leftists Hollerich, Marx, and Cezanne. Yeah, I can't see. I mean, Hollerich is the guy who thinks that he was the Realtor General of the Synod on synodality, and he's the guy who came out publicly and said that the church is wrong on homosexuality. So I don't know how you can be a priest, let alone a cardinal, if you don't believe what the church teaches. Marx, obviously super dodgy, has admitted to moving priests around who abused, and yet Pope Francis asked him to stay on. I think it might go on to say that, actually. The name of the Maltese cardinal, this is my favourite bit in the whole article, I think. The name of the Maltese cardinal, Mario Grech, has been mentioned because he's Secretary General of the Synod on Synodality, a consultative body of bishops and lay activists that the Pope notably didn't bother to consult about the new gay blessings. Grech, unkindly nicknamed the Bozo from Gozo, you'll be hearing that a lot from me from now on, has seen his reputation collapse along with that of the Toothless Synod. His enemies describe him as the biggest toady in the Curia. Unfair to Arthur Roche, many would say. Again, Damien's anti-Roche syndrome leaking out. Grech, how did Grech get a red hat? Well, we know how, that he basically was the one behind the Maltese guidelines, which affirmed Amoris Laetitia. Both him and Scicluna are ambitious men. Scicluna has far more integrity wisdom and intelligence, but Greg is a bully and nasty, and he's basically managed to leapfrog Scicluna, and much like the Gomez-McElroy debacle, you've seen the same thing go on there on Gozo. He's definitely the biggest toady in the Curia. As for hardline conservative papabile, there really aren't any. Francis has at least made sure of that, but there is the moderate conservative possibility, Cardinal Peter Erdo, primate of Hungary. Unlike the exuberant, tearful Tagle, he's an emotionally reserved scholar. When I met him for coffee in London years ago, we were half an hour into the laborious business of using a translator when he suddenly switched into fluent English. He has the reputation of disliking the limelight and being a bit thin-skinned, but at a synod on the family in 2015, despite the arm-twisting from papal apparatchiks, he used his position of Relator General to develop a masterful defence of traditional teaching that was really well done. One Vatican watcher describes him as boringly conservative, which may be just what we need right now. What about more moderate cardinals who are difficult to pigeonhole? The nearest papabile is Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Italian-born Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. His recent months, the horrors on the doorstep, have revealed a diplomat of rare skill. His condemnation of the IDF attacks on civilians in Gaza earned him a rebuke from the Israeli foreign minister, but he hadn't earlier condemned Hamas for its barbarism and offered himself as a hostage in place of the Israeli children. And that really struck a chord with a lot of people, I think. And while it's not hard to believe him when he says he has absolutely no wish to be Pope, it is possible he may be forced to think again. You might notice I've changed the colour of my shirt because I've had to do an extra little bit that we'll stitch together to get this finished because it is quite long and there have been numerous interruptions. So here we go. So I'm just picking it up here from this paragraph, but any Vatican watcher will tell you that new papabili flash through the sky during the last days of the pontificate. This time around, they are busy memorising the names of Asian electors. It's generally assumed that after Francis, we can forget about another Latin American or Jesuit for a few centuries. Well, I mean, that says everything, doesn't it, really, about how this papacy is being received by the majority, I would have thought, of Catholics who are paying attention anyway, even if the general, like there is a thing where the bishops are generally really positive about the Pope. And I would have thought that for most Catholics, they're just quite happy going along with that and ignoring the controversy. So 3 names keep cropping up. William Goh from Singapore, orthodox on sexuality, quietly critical of the surrender to Beijing. Charles Mangbo from Myanmar, also critical of the China deal. And Yu Hong-sik, the new prefect for the dicastery for the clergy for South Korea. Cardinal Yu is a fascinating figure, a teenage convert to Catholicism whose father had either been killed or defected to the north. No one knows. Then he converted the rest of his own family. His faith is joyful and his vision of priestly formation far more attractive than Francis's bitter tirades against clericalism. Now, that is a really good tip there from Damien, because what I hear from people who know is that indeed Yu Hong-sik from South Korea is a very papabile, and that Parolin has, apparently there's a rumour flying around that he's got cancer and he definitely doesn't look very well. But I hear that he is actually supporting Yu Hong-sik's candidacy for the papacy. So that would be interesting, wouldn't it? Finally, you have to consider the most senior elector of all the papabile, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who has Secretary of State, a mixture of Prime Minister and Foreign Secretaries, technically number 2 in the Vatican. The 69-year-old Italian is visibly on manoeuvres and his candidacy is being taken seriously. I'm not so sure about that, personally. And that in itself is odd because Parolin was in office when his deputy Becciu and others were embezzling or gambling with billions of dollars from the church funds. He also was the architect of the Vatican's 2018 deal with Beijing, which, as former Hong Kong Bishop Joseph Cardinal Zen warned him, would turn the Chinese Catholic Church, including persecuted underground believers, into a wholly owned subsidiary of the Communist Party, which is what we seem to have seen come to pass under this papacy. I would say that it's very wise to point out those bits, those particular points. The Betchu thing, that's directly attributable to Parolin, and the China deal. And these will not play out well, I don't think, for any sort of candidacy. And as I say, I hear that he's openly supporting Cardinal Yu Hongsik. That is precisely what happened. Zen, now 92 and regarded by many Orthodox Catholics as a living saint, has used extraordinary language about Parolin. He is so optimistic. That is dangerous. I told the Pope that he, Parolin, has a poisoned mind. He's very sweet, but I have no trust in this person. He believes in diplomacy, but not in our faith. You can kind of imagine that Pope Francis has to deal with a lot of this, and I would imagine that most bishops do. I know when we had a new bishop appointed in my diocese, I was asked to go and talk to him. It was arranged that I went and talked to him, and I was privy to a lot of information about, as a school governor and stuff like that, about stuff that was going on in the diocese. And I think the idea was that I would inform him of all of this information. And I tried, but obviously I didn't know the man at all. I'd never met him before he was appointed. And I would imagine he had a lot of people going to him and trying to persuade him of one position or another. And he was very polite and accepted everything that I had to say, but didn't follow up on anything or ever contact me ever again. So you kind of think he dismissed it. And in a lot of ways, I can understand that, because he didn't know who I was, or what sort of level of integrity I had. And he must have had lots of people trying to influence him. And I would imagine Pope Francis is the same. Pope Francis has a lot of people who are saying, or don't listen to this one, listen to that one. And it's very difficult for anyone in that position to know who to trust, isn't it? This thought is echoed by a Vatican source who has also worked with Parolin. He's very nice to everyone, but hollow in the middle. Also, his health is bad. Everyone in Rome mentions rumours of cancer, and Parolin hasn't denied it. Last time I saw him, he was so frail I was afraid to shake his hand. But another source says, and this gives you a real flavour of Vatican gossip, I wouldn't put it past Parolin's people to exaggerate the cancer thing, because they think the cardinals want a short pontificate. That's shocking, isn't it? No one disputes that Parolin is a smart operator who specialises in making sure his fingerprints are nowhere near the scenes of various crimes. He nuances his statements on Ukraine and Israel, while the Pope puts his foot in it with improvised comments. He love bombs potential enemies, sensing a backlash against Francis. He is tacking right, admitting that Tucho's gay blessings are a nonsense. To his critics, Parolin is the Italian Francis, empty, devious, and sneeringly dismissive of the Latin Mass, an idiotic stance when you consider the surprising fact that the old liturgy is fast acquiring cult status among young Catholics. But are they overlooking one big difference? From the moment he became cardinal, Bergoglio had his eyes set on the papacy, and his gaze never wavered. Parolin, on the other hand, may recognise that he is too compromised to survive successive ballots. Perhaps his real ambition is to become a truly powerful Secretary of State under the next man. And we really don't have a clue who that will be. So much depends on how moderate, non-aligned cardinals vote. They are revealing nothing, especially now that the Vatican and probably the diocesan curia are stuffed with hidden microphones. And this has been repeated time and time again throughout Francis's pontificate, that there's an epidemic of bugging in the Vatican. We can only guess what a swing voter such as Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster is thinking. I don't think he's a swing voter. I think he's a hardcore leftist. Until recently, he invoked the name of Pope Francis with cringe-making frequency. Now, not so much. He must be sick of the meaningless rhetoric of synodality and being pushed around by Arthur Roche. He clearly wasn't impressed by Fiducia. Well, and I think that is probably true. I think that especially the Roche thing is not very nice, because I don't think there's much love lost between them. And I don't know, but I would imagine that, this narrative where Roche was kicked up to Rome because he was such a disaster as a bishop here. Obviously, Vincent Nichols would have been a party to that or involved with that. And then you had the situation where now Roche is his superior and he's telling Nichols what to do. So, I mean, you can just imagine that that's not going down very well. It makes sense. One can easily imagine mildly liberal cardinals voting for a mildly conservative candidate who can tackle the structural damage of the past 11 years. We won't really be able to assess that damage until the new Pope is elected and we see if, how much stabilising work needs to be done in order to do that. And I mean, it looks to me epic. But, who knows? I think we'll get a better idea when the next Pope is elected. Francis has left canon law with so many holes in it that it's like the surface of Mars, says a priest who has worked in the Curia. That's infuriating for cardinals who, like Nichols, are diocesan bishops. They have to decide whether divorced and remarried Catholics can receive communion, a desperately sensitive subject on which the Pope is deliberately evasive. And how do they ensure that these fiducia blessings are spontaneous and non-liturgical? What does that even mean? And we've seen on our last episode of Catholic Unscripted, we covered in the Archdiocese of Chicago a blessing between two women that was conducted by a priest. To all intents and purposes, it's a marriage. And, nothing's been said. Nothing's been said from the Archdiocese. Nothing's been said from Rome. So, what is that if it's not a mess? That it's not clear what we believe, that you can believe whatever you like, really, can't you? Which is, where we are in modernity, that none of it really matters. And then the church becomes meaningless. So, it's a disaster, isn't it? It's a fair bet that their pre-conclave conversations, most cardinals will agree that the next pope must be someone capable of supervising an emergency repair job that clarifies doctrine, the scope of ecclesial authority, and puts an end to the jihad against traditionalist Catholics, many of whom are a generation or two younger than the jargon-spouting boomers harassing them. Also, the cardinals, they know, must delve into the past of leading contenders. They have no choice. The next pope will face instant, merciless scrutiny from online investigators. A 2021 article in the Tablet by church historian Alberto Maloney described an all-too-credible catastrophe. The newly elected pope steps out, and as he smiles and humbly introduces himself to the crowds in the square, a lone social media post makes a stunning allegation. The new post when a bishop had failed to act against the priest who went on to commit further crimes. In the square and the press boxes, eyes drop from the balcony to their smartphones. The Pope steps back inside and resigns. The see is again vacant. The necessary scrutiny will be an awkward business, but at the very least the cardinals mustn't repeat the mistake they made by their previous predecessors in 2013. That is, taking a candidate at his own estimation. The truth is that many Catholics in Argentina from across the ideological spectrum knew about Francis's character flaws, his compulsive secrecy, score settling, disturbing alliances, and rule by fear, but no one asked them. And I've been told that by Argentinians that lived in Buenos Aires, so that is a known fact. One might argue that none of the 120 plus eligible cardinals is quite so mean-spirited as the Holy Father. Fair enough. But there should be no question of electing anyone who imitates Francis's modus operandi. No chameleons, in other words. No one who is orthodox under Benedict, liberal under Francis, and is now slinking back to the centre. The new pope must be a holy man who relies on lieutenants who have no dirt on him and whom he has no dirt. And it's a shocking fact that this would represent a departure from recent precedent. The pope must be above reproach. That is far more important than whether he's a liberal or a conservative. I mean, if you think about that, the new pope's going to have to get rid of all these people that Francis has put in key positions as well, who have got tainted backgrounds. Heads will roll. Traditionalists will disagree, but I don't think it's a bad college of cardinals. Cynics might say that's because Francis, having made factional appointments early on, lost interest and appointed independent-minded men by accident. But let's not neglect the role of social media. While the Praetorian Guard have been busy hiding things, countless websites have been making life difficult for the poisonous old toads who have been trying to fix conclaves for the better part of 2,000 years. Maloney is probably right. As the new Supreme Pontiff shuffles onto the balcony, there will be an unnerving moment while the faithful check their mobiles. But if the cardinals have done their job properly, the applause will quickly resume. And if you listen carefully, you will hear another voice coming from every office in the Vatican, a sigh of relief that the Squid Game is finally over. So I think that's an absolutely outstanding article there from Damien Thompson. Very interesting and well written. And it gives us lots of insight into what's going on, I think. In terms of Paper Belay, you've got some people that aren't mentioned there, like Cardinal Wim Ejik. I think that's the right pronunciation, from the Netherlands. And he, I think he's a real possibility as well. So we'll have to see what happens. But I think the biggest thing is don't lose hope. Obviously, the church is amazing, and what it teaches doesn't change, even if someone at the top is getting it wrong. So stay faithful to Christ, stay faithful to the church, and I'll see you on the next video. God bless you.